Hello, good evening, everybody. It's 6 o'clock. You know me, I'm Chris Sammons, Principal at West Island School, and broadcasting for this evening on a webinar as part of our parents' events. And I'd just like to introduce Claire and Rebecca to you, and they're going to join us, and I'll let them introduce themselves for a minute or so while we're waiting for more people to join us. Claire?
Hello, great to be with you all this evening. I'm Claire Howarth and I lead the pre-16 phase of the school as Vice Principal. Lovely to see you all.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Priest. I'm one of the school counsellors here. Yeah, really pleased to be here to support Chris and Claire with this webinar. Should be really interesting. Some of you might have tuned in a couple of weeks ago to a webinar I presented on supporting the emotional needs of a growing teenager and parenting in an online environment. So really pleased to be with you all again today.
Great, thanks very much. And what's going to happen is that Claire and Rebecca are going to be in the background, and if you're new to webinars, you'll see down below there's a little box that says Q&A, and if there's some questions that you'd like specifically answering or things that come to mind as we're going through this presentation, you can drop a question into the Q&A and both Claire and Rebecca will try to answer them. They've also seen the script for this evening, so if they think that it's going to be covered a little bit later on in the talk, then they'll just let you know that. So I'd give it about 10 minutes, and then I'd kind of think about some questions, just so you get the sense of what we'll be covering. And then Claire and Rebecca will join us at the end to take any final questions or whatever themes they've noticed that are coming up as well. So I'll get going. So let me just share my screen with you and get going with the presentation. So I will just zoom all the way backwards. Best to start at the beginning. And this is what we're doing. So we're having a conversation this evening about the myths and reality about screen time. And why I volunteered myself for this presentation is because a number of parents were starting to question the amount of time that young people are on their computers. So it kind of provoked me to do as much research as I could to satisfy myself in what we were asking families and young people to be concerned with. But the fact is that young people in our school tend to spend, whilst they're at school, between 3 to 3.5 hours a day in lessons interacting with screens. That doesn't mean that all their attention will be absorbed by that screen in that 3 and 3.5 hours, but it will be a medium of exchange to facilitate the teaching and learning. So it's kind of not true to say that students are spending much more time on screens during the day whilst we've had this Zoom period, but I guess from a parent's point of view, some of it's a bit more noticeable. And what's curious about that is that screen time is quite emotive. So I'm a parent of 3 children myself, that you know, and the emotive thing about it is that sometimes as parents, screen time is quite useful to us because we have jobs that we want to get on with. It can keep the children quiet. We know it's a pacifier. And then we then have our own guilt trip about it because we also worry about the fact that too much screen time is a bad thing. And also here we are with this sense of more screen time as a result of the COVID crisis and the way that we're schooling through Zoom. So I'm going to invite you, if you'd like to look in your Q&A box, whilst I'm talking for the next minute or so, what worries you the most about screens in your child? So if you pop some comments in that Q&A box, and perhaps we'll loop back to them at the end and see if we've addressed them. So what really does worry you about screens in your child? Because the more I thought about this, I have been surrounded by screens for my whole life. And this is my journey with screens. So it started off with a television. I clearly remember one day when Dad came home with a Binatone and we played the ping pong tennis. My parents then bought me a VIC-20. I'm sure there's other people old enough in this audience to remember ZX81s, the first, and VIC-20s, the first personal computers. I remember my Nokia. But it's really when things went into the mobile with the touch screen that things started to move forward for us. And because that was no longer a phone in your hand, it was actually a computer in your hand. And actually most of us, the last thing we use our mobile phones for is to make calls. We actually use them as devices to be constantly online. And I guess the generation that we're into now is apps, and how apps simplify the world for us. So we have even higher levels of interactivity with screens. And then congratulations for those of you who know the symbol that's running across the bottom of your screen, because that of course is Siri. And if you've upgraded your Apple iPhone in the last year or so, you will know that the functionality of Siri is improving all the time. So we're into this next version of artificial intelligence. But I guess the message that I want to work with tonight is in all of the research that we've done as a community, and that we also know anecdotally, is screens on their own aren't really the problem. It's what you do with them that matters. And so very much part of this evening's presentation is trying to hold this in mind. What does the research say about screens, and what actually really matters? So moving on, this is where most of the research sits. And the thing that I want to say to you is that the academic research around screen time actually tells us that if you are a fully functioning family, and that you are as healthy as you possibly can be in your family relationships, then actually your children will be able to absorb quite a lot of radiation from screens, that you really won't be doing very much harm at all by allowing your children onto screens. So what we really need to think about is we really need to think about these main areas of research that fall into sleep, mood, aggression, displacement, so what my son or daughter could be doing instead, how it impacts on their relationships with others and also with themselves, and then the issue of can we get addicted to screens or not. So we'll unpack those fears one at a time over the next 30 to 40 minutes. Secondly, what I'd really like to do is I'd like to think about how we actually kind of manage that in our parenting. And finally, might be an opportunity to think about what action you want to take about it, how it makes you feel, and particularly to remember that screens have many, many benefits. They have benefits in our lives for joy, for creativity, and actually for improving our cognitive mood as well. So science can't really help us decide whether screens are good or bad, because we don't actually have enough randomized trials and we don't have enough longitudinal studies over a number of years. So nobody can tell you for sure exactly what's going to happen. But what the vast majority of researchers will tell you is that it is the individual differences with your children that makes the biggest difference. So in other words, for lots of kids, there will be simply no problems whatsoever. So let's try and dig down a little bit more deeply by looking at sleep and what the research tells us about sleep. Well, in 2017, there was a study in the US of 2,048 12 to 17-year-olds. And what it found was that those people that had an electronic device in their bedroom slept an average of 20 minutes less per night. So the question then becomes, does 20 minutes matter? And yes, it does, because the impact of having less than 20 minutes cumulatively every night over your lifetime is significant for future vulnerability to dementia in old age. And what we're finding out increasingly is some of the chemicals in our brain chemistry, which are building up over our lifetime, could have an implication for our health when we're in our old age. Now, having 1 hour less sleep a night is the same impact as being moderately drunk. And you can do this for yourself as an experiment. Just take 6 hours sleep per night and test yourself in the morning on how you feel. And most of us feel groggy, a bit disorientated, and we have this feeling of having to push through the things that we need to get through. So the cumulative impact of not having enough sleep can be detrimental to us. Now, the thing about the mobile phone is the blue light. So the blue light stops melatonin, and melatonin is the chemical that tells you to go to sleep. So having the mobile in our bedroom, having the blue light on before we go to sleep isn't going to put us in the best situation to fall asleep. And then the other thing we've got going on is cortisol. So how many of you as parents have been tempted to pick up your phone just as you're dropping off to sleep because the image starts to come onto the screen? You're conscious that there's something going to come in early in the morning and you want to just check whether something's going to come into you. And that temptation exists for our young people as well. And the problem is that you get cortisol. So cortisol is the stress hormone. So you get this mix of melatonin, which is keeping you awake, and cortisol, which is responding to kind of the snarky quips or the things that are on your mind. And it's those things that actually stop you getting to sleep well. And of all the things that we're going to look at tonight, sleep is perhaps the thing that is most connected to that cascade of physical, emotional, and mental health issues that really do worry us about young people. And what I'm showing you down here on the left-hand part of the screen is a typical sleep cycle. So over an 8-hour period of sleep, you can see that we fall into periods of deep sleep after about an hour, and then we come out of that into what's called rapid eye movement, and then we keep moving back into deep sleep and then back into lighter sleep. And a typical sleeping pattern for any of us is about 4 periods of deep sleep per evening. Now, what brain researchers and sleep researchers will tell you is the golden hour happens in that 7th and 8th hour of sleep. So unless you actually get to that 7th and 8th hour of sleep, you reduce the benefit of sleeping altogether. And it's that 7th and 8th hour of sleep where you get the deepest brain waves that really cleanse the brain of the chemicals that have built up during the day. And it's that the sleep researchers really worry about. So lots of people kid themselves that they can cut down on their sleep to 5 or 6 hours. But what they don't understand is the biggest benefit of sleep actually happens in the 7th to 8th hour. And if you keep missing out on your sleep cycle and you never get to that 4th or that 5th cycle of deep sleep, then what we're discovering is that our detrimental harm to us both now and in the future. And typically, if you do that over a sustained period, this is exactly how it feels first thing in the morning. And I bet there's some people in the audience this evening who this is a typical pattern for them in their lives. So the medical advice is really unequivocal around sleep, that banning screens from bedrooms is the best thing you can possibly do. And the most effective thing is to make sure there's no phones 1 hour before bedtime, so you don't have that effect of the blue light. Now, just to try and give you some data on this, this was a study that was done in 2016. There's 3 age groups. You can see we've got young children, we've got middle children who are 8 to 12 years, so that's kind of our year 7s and 8s, and then we've got adolescents, and you'll see the adolescents is this middle line here, and you'll see between 0 and 10 hours that we're not really increasing sleep disturbance very much, typically in this research of over 2,000 young people. So up to 10 hours, we're only increasing sleep disturbance by 0.5. So we could say that whilst it's not been ideal during this Zoom period of time, that actually the only thing we're looking at is 5 hours on screen during learning time, and then perhaps if a young person's got 3 to 5 hours of personal study or a bit of leisure time, that we really should be thinking about, well, you know, no more than 10 hours. And I bet most of you are thinking 10 hours is pretty long, but it soon adds up. But you'll see after this 10th hour, we get this kick up for adolescents where we can start getting lots more sleep disturbance. And that's going to impact on general mood, irritability, and feelings of not being able to cope. So it's about being mindful of the total length of time, but not being overly worried about this time up to the 10th hour of screen time. Now, this is about sleep duration, and what you'll see here is if we're looking at adolescence again, so this is the bottom line in adolescence, you'll see that up to 10 hours of screen time doesn't impact massively on sleep duration. So for adolescents, that's 13 to 17-year-olds, even having 10 hours of screen time, they're probably still going to get their 8 hours and probably do need a little bit more in early adolescence. But it matters most of all for the middle childhood years, so the 8 to 12-year-olds, which is here. And you'll see that it starts to impact a bit more in terms of length of sleep, and certainly for younger children, so our primary age children, we certainly don't want to be going past that kind of between 4 and 6 hour window. But in this scenario, what we're saying is we need to be mindful of sleep, but we don't need to be over worried about the sleep time in this period. And I'm going to talk to you about obesity, because obesity is one that we can overlook in Asia, because whilst we have fairly good records of obesity, there is still things for us to watch out for. So this is really the second most established correlation that we can have between screen time and another factor that makes us human and maintains our health. Because when children are eating in front of screens, they tend to take on more calories, and they tend to take on more high density calories that are difficult to deal with and process. So we need to be careful about obesity if our children are spending very, very long times and we see weight gain as well, and there's no exercise happening in their daily routines. This was perhaps the most worrying thing about screen time, but this isn't relation to screen time. This is relation to what you're doing on a screen, and this is called brand tagging. So Facebook and some social media apps, you can tag your friend's favorite brand of food when you see it, but all you're doing is actually providing data so that the brands can target more advertising. So in itself, it's not a bad thing being on a screen, looking at other people, but when you start tagging what your friend's favorite brand is, which seems a nice thing to do and provides a little light-hearted interaction, what you're doing is you're giving data to these brands to start pushing more adverts out to your children. And the saying is, children eat while they watch, and they eat what they watch as well. And finally, what we know is too much screen time is a displacement activity. So screen time can be good. What we've seen is that a length of screen time seems acceptable. But what we need to make sure is it's not at the cost of displacement. And what the latest health advice will be is for young people, we really want to make sure that they've got about 50 minutes of very high energy, high intensity exercise, and running is the best possible thing that we can do with young people. Now, let's move on to addiction. So some parents said, I feel like my child might be addicted. And this is something that we need to have a little bit of caution about, because it made me think about this man here, Frederick Wortham, who was a famous psychologist in the 50s, and he wrote a book called The Seduction of the Innocent. And it was about the time in the 50s in the US when comics were becoming very widely distributed and read. And he claimed to have undertaken some research to prove that this new type of media was addictive and was harmful to young people. And this was actually a quote which was shared at Congress, where he said that reading a Batman magazine could actually stimulate children to be homosexual. Now, what he was doing at that time was he was feeding into fears which were creating moral panic. But this now would just seem laughable to us. And in fact, the original research that he did, some of it has actually been sealed and isn't available to us. But those that the research that has been looked at has been completely proven to be false and not reliable. So when we're asking our question about young people being addicted, we have to be really cautious that we're not creating moral panic or we're not pathologizing. So my advice here is just to slow down a little bit and to think more carefully about what might be happening for young people. Now, most studies about addiction and most of the reporting that we get on video is about young people becoming addicted, but most of the studies that the media look at are unrepresentative, and that's because they actually come from the gaming community themselves. So it's not really reliable to study addiction where you're only looking at those people that game. What you need to do is you need to have a representative sample of an entire population and then work out what's the proportion of that entire population that might be gaming. And Mark Griffiths, who's a professor at the College of Business and Law in Nottingham-Trent, a chartered psychologist, he works at the International Gaming Research Unit and has over 100 published peer-reviewed papers, believes that addiction to gaming is a real thing, but the proportion of people who suffer from this is very, very low. What he says is that most studies overestimate it, and actually there are only 2 representative samples in the whole world where we can reliably look at the data. And he says in those studies, which were conducted in Singapore and Norway, that this would be what the data suggests, that the vast majority of people are not going to become addicted to gaming or addicted to the internet or addicted to computer use or screens. About 4% will be engaged, and then we're getting about 7.5% where it would be problematic. But the genuine number who are addicted is around 1.4%. So we're looking at about 10 people per 1,000. So in a school such as West Island, where we've got 1,200 students, we're probably looking about up to 12 students, not that are addicted, but if they were a normal sample, might potentially have those things going for them. What is more typical is that there might be problematic use. And it's this that parents perhaps are thinking about when they worry about their young people and screens. Now, the other interesting things in that study was the risk factors, so those things that make people in the study more vulnerable to problematic use, had either been originating from one of those continents, Africa, Asia, South and Middle America. There was a negative correlation with conscientiousness. So the more conscientious students were, the less likely they were to be addicted. So how that helps us is to think about some of the routines our children might have. How is conscientiousness showing up? If we're seeing very low levels of conscientiousness alongside problematic or habits which interfere with life, then it might be that we've got more of a sense of problematic behaviour. And then there's a positive correlation with your neuroticism. Now, this is a personality type, and we all have personality types. Some of us have a type of personality where we might be more vulnerable to experience feelings of anxiety and worry and fear. And so it's these things which are likely to feed into those young people to become problematic or addicted. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to happen. It just means that those things are more likely going to exist. So why I'm sharing this is because I want you to be really clear that probably what you're seeing in your child is not addiction, but you're seeing some problematic use, or you're seeing some indicators that there's a need to put a few more boundaries around your child's use of gaming or computer use. And these are the criteria that some psychologists will agree on, but addiction is quite a discussed topic amongst psychologists because it's quite difficult to really genuinely apply the word in a pathological sense and claim that somebody has a condition. The bar is actually very, very high. And so, you know, is gaming happening to the extent that you simply can't get your child to move in the morning to come to school? Are they absolutely not able to hold a conversation with you when you get rid of the games? Yes, you might have a little bit of an argument over the way it's being done, but it's only when it's become so problematic and that there's no other way that you can address the needs of correcting problematic use that you would be getting into the world of addiction. But if you're seeing lots of signs that make you feel uncomfortable, it may well be that you're getting into this area of problematic use. And there are two ways in which games create addiction. One is a very low level and what might appear to be an innocent approach, where there might be a game where you're going around a maze and you're collecting diamonds, for example. And the addiction there is the completion of the quest and not feeling worthy or complete if the quest hasn't been completed. And then the second type of addiction is when there's a game that has no ending. So you want to keep going and keep excelling and keep becoming top of the pile. And so I hate to kind of break the news to you, but you can actually become addicted to Minecraft. So I remember when my children were young, Minecraft had just come online, and I very much convinced myself that hours of gaming on Minecraft was fine because this was low level, it wasn't high violence, it was constructive. However, what you need to be aware of is what the total length of time is going to be that you're going to allow your children into the Minecraft world, because it's about the features of it that can become problematic. And if you go back to studies that were done on adults in the 80s, and many of you remember Tetris, and everybody will remember Candy Crush, some of you will have played that to extreme, whereby you go to bed and you can still visualize the graphics in your brain moving because perhaps you've played it for too long a length of time. And Tetris dreams and Candy Crush dreams were for a while were a studied phenomena. So the reason why these games work is because they produce dopamine, and the dopamine is actually delivering a reward mechanism in the brain for young people that makes them want to keep going. And the more they keep going, the more they get rewarded. But the game is clever enough to make sure that they're not rewarded every time. And I'm hoping that everybody can identify with a one-armed bandit in a casino. That is the, you've all seen the pictures in the Las Vegas casinos where you feed the dimes and you pull the one-armed bandit to see if you can line up 3 lemons or 3 pieces of fruit before you win. And lots of psychologists study addiction on one-armed bandits. And what they will tell you is you only need to win for 30% of the time to create an addiction for somebody. And what they'll also tell you is that the electronic one-armed bandits are not as good as actually having to physically pull a lever. Because when you physically pull a lever, there's a belief that you have some control over the game. So brain researchers will earn hundreds of thousands of pounds working for games companies to exploit these mechanisms with games to keep people coming back. Now, remember, it's a very, very high bar that you've got to meet before you can say, my child is addicted. So for most of us, what we're dealing with is we're dealing with irritating behaviour around gaming, because maybe my adolescent doesn't come down for dinner when I say, or they don't seem to have other interests, or it's problematic. Okay, my teenager's ready to have an argument with me about this, but it's very unlikely that your child is addicted. However, if all of these things here on this screen now are true for you, and if you have attempted to moderate your child's behaviour, even if it causes a row, or even if it causes uncomfortable things to happen, only after that, and you really are failing to put boundaries in place, is perhaps to kind of reach out and get some professional support and help. But before you get there, of course, you're always welcome to call any one of our pastoral team or Rebecca to help you kind of approach that. So the way to think about problematic behaviour is that it's really a symptom. And for most young people, gaming or spending long times of gaming is a symptom of being a teenager. It's not really a symptom of being addicted. So particularly with the games that are very social, where you join in with people online, that's exactly what teenagers need to do. They need to affiliate with each other. That's how they build their credibility in groups. It's how they learn values from one another. And the thing to think about is to think about how the game is influencing your child, but what it might be telling you. So think about, do they seem to need this for their self-esteem? Do they seem to need this because they're not very good at maintaining relationships at school, and not over-analysing it, but just having a sense that perhaps it isn't all doom and gloom, and it's just an indicator that this is the teenage years, and it's about putting some thoughts into that. So I'm going to look at violence now, and what I want to share with you about violence is that we've known a lot about violence since the 1960s. And the reason we know a lot about violence is because of some experiments which were done by Bandura. And this was called the Bobo doll experiment. And what happened in the 1960s was the doll was placed into a room with young children. Young children saw people being violent or being aggressive, and then they were left in the room with the clown. And what they were likely to do is they were likely to hit the clown, and they were likely to copy the violence that they'd seen. So we've got very good experimental evidence from a number of years that tells us that exposure to violence means that young people will imitate it and are more likely going to imitate it. Now, we also have good data because we know that when you watch violent movies or when you watch violent games, we can plug you into heart monitors and respiration monitors, and we know that it pumps adrenaline around your system. So we know that the body will have more fight and flight mechanisms which are happening. And it's in that enhanced state that lots of people then do some further research. Now, the good news is that even though in the press there are reports of people that have gone on to do mass shootings, that actually watching the violent video games isn't very likely the things that has tipped those people over the edge to do that. So it is highly, highly unlikely that young people will be committing large-scale violent acts as a result of seeing violence in games. However, what the studies will tell you is that the levels of aggression which they see will have an impact. So playing online games does lead to real life aggression. It is a causal factor in aggressive behaviour, and we do know that it's a precursor to aggression in later life. Might not be physical violence, it might actually just be aggression in the way that we talk to each other, and aggression can also be in desensitization. So one of the things that have changed in gaming is what's called the first shooter scenario. So something like the Call of Duty, whereby you're looking down the barrel of a gun. And what this does is this desensitizes you to violence. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be more susceptible to wanting to own a gun or to shooting anybody. There's a huge difference between playing a shooting game and actually then being prepared to go through with something. And you're likely to have much more pathologically some mental illness. However, what it does do is it desensitizes you to violent acts. So what it means is when you see something that's violent, it probably just won't register in quite the same way as much as it used to. And where we see that most of all is in reduced empathy. So one of the things that as a principal I can tell you that I've worked with families on, and I've also seen it in my own children as well, is when parents say that their children are talking to them in a different tone, or they become much more unreasonable in some of the things they're being asked to do. And largely that will be because the children have become desensitized, not because they're any more violent, but because they're lacking in empathy. And high diets in violent images will of course reduce your empathy. So it's not rocket science that you can allow this to happen in terms of gaming, but perhaps what we need to do is monitor the length of time, and we also need to monitor the type of game and how long on the type of game. So it's not about banning it altogether, because games are incredibly sociable. It allows you to fail well in a low-risk environment. It allows you to build credibility in your peer group. It allows you to connect and have friendship in ways that's very different. But what we need to be doing as adults is just be conscious that when we become uncomfortable with it, or when we spot signs in our children that they're losing empathy, that perhaps that's an indicator that the length of time on games needs just pulling in a little bit. Now, mood is the thing where research goes big, and that's because of the imagery we see. So most obviously, if you're being feeding yourself in your screen time lots of negative images, your brain will start to believe that the world is a bad and scary place. And the more apps you put onto your phone, the more news you get delivered to you, the more you engage with the negative images that happen in life, guess what? The lower your mood's going to become. And that's because the brain can't unsee things. So one of the things that you very much need to manage for both yourself and for young people is what image do you think is suitable for them, and how long and how many images do you think you should expose yourselves to? Because quite simply, what it will do is it will put your brain on higher alert than it needs to be. It will store memories in different ways, and those memories will become narratives in different ways that are beyond our control. So there's something about not just the length of time, but what images we're looking at online. And quite honestly, as we have become desensitized to the news imagery, we get more and more and more of this into our media feeds. Now, research is also quite large in terms of social media, and this is the one that I think parents will most identify with. And I can tell you that very often when my children were adolescents, we were on holiday or we're in the house, one moment my child could be in a very good mood, and then all of a sudden the atmosphere would change, and I had no understanding why. And it took me a very long time to work out it wasn't something that was happening in our household, it was something that was happening over social media that I hadn't even spotted. So mood disorders such as anxiety and depression are very much correlated to screen use around social media. And all of these are social media, including TikTok, which can be positive, but also there is some media on TikTok which isn't very positive. And I will also tell you that as an adult, if you're doing a lot of getting sucked into LinkedIn as well, you're probably going to be impacted by this as well. No social media is neutral. Now, what I really want to share about this is the research which was done with a first study of its kind in 2012 to 2018. And the reason why it was the first study of its kind was because it was a longitudinal study. So it was undertaken in Canada. There were 3,826 adolescents and 31 schools. It was actually in Montreal. And the students were surveyed every single year of their adolescence, and they were surveyed with a standard psychological tool to assess their vulnerability to depression, and they were also assessed with a psychological tool which has good validity to assess the effect on their self-esteem. So what the researchers were able to do is they were able to look at what was happening to somebody at age 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, and what was happening to their daily habits around their use of media. And so really interesting, because for the first time, it followed a group of young people for over 4 years. And this is what it found. It found that the least depressed adolescents were spending lots of time in front of television. And what they found was, however, that the more time they spent watching television, the more depressive symptoms they seemed to accumulate. Now, that's a bit odd. But what it was suggesting was that in the early years of adolescence, 12, 13, 14, watching lots of television was probably harmless. But as young people became more conscious of the images on television, that there was an upward social comparison, that they were starting to understand perhaps what life was like inside of the screen and comparing what their own lives were like. So on its own, television watching is not a bad thing, and it would seem for a good length of time. But it's when your children are starting to not understand that television is not real, and they think that they are worth less because it's feeding into their self-esteem. Now, the study also showed as well that video gaming is not associated with depression, that there was no causal link whatsoever. However, it was correlated with aggression and desensitization. So they saw the kids displaying less empathy levels. So really the conclusion from that is that gaming is not necessarily bad, but we just need to have our eye on excessive length and the type of gaming that children are doing. And then the last conclusions which came out of the study were about social media. And these are the ones that we need to pay most attention to. And this is that social media is about social comparison. And what was very clear in this study is that as a teenager went through their teenage years from 12 to 17, they were more likely to experience some depression or anxiety symptoms. Doesn't mean they were going to develop it, it just meant they were more likely going to experience some of the symptoms. And what it also found out was if a teenager was already depressed, then actually being on social media would make it an awful lot worse. Now, this kind of is common sense, really, isn't it? That's statistically proven in that longitudinal study. So social media is really the one that we have to watch with young people and depressive symptoms and anxiety. Now, the study was also great because it also looked at general computer use. And what the message is that parents need to have responsibility to monitor media and content and time that their children spend with media and content, but not necessarily general computer use. What the study found was that general computer use, so researching for school records or school homework, presenting work to hand in the next day, interacting and finding things out, coding, all of that actually had a positive impact on your emotional well-being. And why they thought that existed was because young people were demonstrating self-efficacy. They were actually learning and they were actually becoming good at something. So something that is creative, something that is solving problems, something that is linked to finding things out, developing opinions and views. The study suggested young people can spend as much time as they possibly want doing those things. So what it means is, in terms of hourly usage on Zoom time with teachers that are designing learning and lessons, there's hardly any impact for young people whatsoever. Of course they're going to get a bit bored, of course they're going to get a bit down that they haven't seen their friends, but these studies are suggesting there's no impact on mental health or mental illness. Getting bored is just part of life, and when your children are back at school for a length of time, they're going to be a little bit bored because that's going to become their normal routine as well. But what it won't do is it won't actually feed into any sense of mental illness. So we have to be really clear that it's about the other things that young people are doing, which we need to be cautious of as adults. And I came across this very difficult case which exists in the UK at the moment, and you can find it on the BBC newsreel, although I've just told you to drop your newsreels, and that's the case of Molly Russell. And Molly Russell is a young person that unfortunately died by suicide. And the courts in the UK issued some data privacy requests to both Instagram and Facebook because they wanted to see what she was looking at. Because what they found out was that she was searching for, using search terms like depression, like suicide. What the prosecutors think is that the algorithms in Instagram and Facebook were learning what Molly liked to look at, and it was delivering more and more media of what she liked to look at. So in a sense, the artificial intelligence had actually worked against this young person. Now, I don't know how that case is going to go, but what I know is artificial intelligence seems to know what I like and I don't like, even though I keep trying to outfox it. So I believe that this could be true. I don't know if it is true. And so we have to think carefully about our young people's use. And this is what I'm going to say to you to just draw back a little bit, so it's not all very terrifying, is that most young people are dandelions. And in the UK, dandelions grow like weeds. And I'm not suggesting that your young people aren't valuable, they are. What I'm suggesting is that weeds survive in lots of environments perfectly fine. They don't need anything else but what's there. They're hardy, they're resilient, and they can thrive. However, there are a small number of children that are orchids, and that means they're highly sensitive. You know what it's like to keep an orchid. You think you've got it right, and then something happens and it just all collapses. So the point about this presentation really is to keep in mind that screens and screen times are not the problem, it's what we're doing with them that really matters. So I'm just aware of timing now, and I've gone a little bit longer than I would normally do. So I'm going to move on to the second part is, well, what do we do about that? And you won't be too unsurprised to know that one of the first things that we have to do is we have to address our own behaviour. There's nothing more irritating for a young person than the double standards that adults have. And I'm absolutely guilty of all of these three scenarios. I'm not presenting myself here as a saint or having all the answers or even an expert, but I'm telling you that this is real life for most of us. And even when I don't want to look at my mobile phone, I still find myself doing it. It's designed that well, even to the point that my face actually opens it now. I don't even have to try. Everything I try and put in place to stop my use of it, the technology companies seem to unblock it for me. So the very first thing that you have to do as an adult is you have to make some commitment. And perhaps what you have to do is make some commitment as a family, because whilst 78% of adults rate themselves as good role models to their children, in the same study, 90% of kids were able to outline in detail what they were learning from their parents without their parents really understanding it. And if you're a new year 7 parent, if we were in the school hall, I'd ask your children to put their hands up if they thought mum or dad spent too long on their screens. And without doubt, every young person would have put their hand up. So the first thing we have to do is we have to think about what we are modelling as adults to young people before we start worrying about young people themselves. Now, we also have to model what we do, because your children follow you and they learn from you. Quite often, a parent will come into my office and they will show me a WhatsApp message that somebody else has sent in one of these large groups because they're outraged by somebody else and the way they're approaching things. Personally, what I do is I don't really take it personally from me or for the school, but I do worry what the parent has just taught their child if their child ever saw that comment. What are they learning about how to engage with problems that arise or how they should bring things to the fore? Facebook, you will know, sometimes irritates people because it should be deemed brag book. And you have to think carefully about what the intention of your Facebook accounts is. Is it about advertising the wonderful life that you're leading? Because very few people actually post the real life that they're leading. And you have to think carefully about what your children are learning from your own social media as well. And actually, when the researchers look at it, the most challenge that people have with their Facebook friends is that they are fed up with the complaining that happens. So it's just a natural part of life, isn't it, that we raise the things that irritate us more than celebrate the things that are good. But just have an audit with a fresh pair of eyes on your own social media and think to yourself, what would my child be learning in this moment if they saw my social media accounts? And then there's how you're going to be. So this is a strategy which I have regularly used with my children, and that is to speak louder, to speak longer, and wear them down until they do what I want. And it's a really quick strategy. It's effective in the short run, and if I'm really persistent, then I can normally get what I want. But it's not really that healthy, and it's not something that most of us would advise. What we really need to be thinking about is how we can move from that style to the coaching style. And gosh, does this take a lot of hard work, because it does mean about listening. It means about getting alongside. It's about having some empathy for what young people are going through. And it's about how we develop our conflict resolution skills as well. So there's a number of things that we need to think about. Is once we've attended to our own media use and our own screen use, we can only then start the conversation with our children and start sharing the concerns. And what are those concerns? But engaging young people in the conversation, so it's a piece of education work for them. Now, you could go full detox. Isn't this beautiful? This is the most stunning scenery that you can find in our national parks in Hong Kong. It takes less than an hour for any of us to get to. And we've got a 4-day-long weekend coming up. I think if you've never done a digital detox before, 4 days, quite tough in the first go. But why don't you just try it for 24 hours? And then the next time you have a holiday, do a 48-hour detox. Just let everybody know all the digital gear is going away, and just identify with the feelings that you're having when it's happening. But detoxing is most definitely a great thing to do. Now, this year, when I went on holiday, I promised myself that I wouldn't check my emails for just 2 weeks, and I would be present with my family. And unfortunately, because of what was happening in the IB world, I really let myself down, and there wasn't a single day this year that I haven't responded to a number of work emails. Now, that is my job, but I don't think it's good for me, and I don't think it's good for my family. And I've promised myself that in my summer holiday next year, there will be 2 weeks where I completely go offline, because longer term, I don't want to kind of get caught up in the way that I know that I'm currently caught up in media use. So I think detoxing is something I'm personally going to work on. Now, you can also think about your boundary setting. And what's really interesting in boundary setting is most of us work intermittently. And intermittently is the most often used boundary setting. Now, intermittent boundary setting in psychology is when you get a pigeon and you get a feeder and you teach the pigeon to peck on a button and it gets a treat, a little bit of seed. And if you randomly give it a treat, that pigeon will peck until its head drops off, because it will keep going until it's exploited every last chance. Now, most of us in our parenting work that way. We use screens when it suits us, and then we use screens when it doesn't suit us. We put rules in when we feel guilty, and then when things are going fine, we think everything's all right with the world. But really what we're doing is we're conditioning our children to just keep trying and wearing us down, even when we've said no. It's a bit like the sweet scenario. If you go to the supermarket and you're not always consistent, consistency is the key for young people in them being able to respect boundaries that you're setting. The next often used strategy for setting boundaries by parents is by reward. So yes, you can play that game provided you've done this. And then lots of families have days of the week which they try to maintain as screen-free, or times during the day. And then some families who I really respect and admire, and I must admit I never got consistent with this one, there was kind of some clear rules. You get to do your own screen time for leisure or recreation purposes when all these other things have been checked off and been done. And that takes a lot of setting up, but once you've got it in place, it does prove to be the most effective mediator for young people. So I want to draw things back for you now about what we've looked at. We've looked at the research in terms of screen times and how it can impact on our children in these 6 areas. And I want you to think dandelions and orchids. So the vast majority of our young people are not going to be impacted, but a few of them might be. This is not a highly scientific table. This was me just trying to summarize for myself where we might be after all of this research. TV watching, lots of it, very low risk, lots of high benefit. But beware that as your teenager grows older, if they're falling into the trap of upward social comparison. Computer use, being on Zoom lessons for 5 hours a day, following up the research, the homework, very low risk, very high benefit, not really a problem. Gaming, medium risk. So depends on the total time spent and the graphic content, but also recognize there is benefit for your young child gaming, and there's lots to be lost if you're the only parent that bans your child because you exclude them from a group. Perhaps as a group of parents, find out who's in the group game and decide as a group so that your children can't come back at you, but you're the meanest parent in the town and everybody else is letting somebody else do it. Communications apps like WhatsApp, medium risk, medium benefit, but beware who's contacting your child without your knowing. And for me, social media has the highest risk and reasonable benefit. So it's about the boundaries that you need to attend to with your children in this scenario, and in particular, watching out for vulnerabilities around upward social comparison. X has this life, I only have this life, I'm worthless, they're worth more, they've got more likes, they've got more friends, and that creation of a false narrative around the social media. So what I'm really hoping to do is show you, for the vast majority of children, for the vast majority of the time, the screen use isn't a problem, but it's about you attending to it very consciously and very consistently in your parenting as the mediator. And really what Gandhi said was, you've got to put your money where your mouth is, that practice is worth more than a ton of preaching. So don't get off this Zoom call tonight and expect to be brilliant parents around screen time by tomorrow morning. This is a lifetime's work for yourself and for your children. Just maybe start discussing some of the general principles that have spoken to you, and perhaps confirm what you think and feel. And there's bags of room to follow up with your own research as well. But I'll leave you with some top 10 rules. No more than 10 hours of total screen time a day, which is loads, and no devices now before bedtime. Try and keep all of the devices out of the bedroom if you possibly can, because remember, really poor quality sleep and not enough of it is going to feed into those conditions of depression and obesity. Absolutely understand if time is the way you set boundaries, but perhaps think about priorities, and also being conscious of warning signals, that you'll allow the time to happen so long as you don't see the warning signals of loss of empathy or tiredness, or interference in normal habits, or relationships starting to creep in. And have a really open conversation. There's nothing worse as a young person than being told what you to do without being listened to. Even if parents come up with a rule that you don't like, you can live with it if you feel there's been a bit of listening. Absolute must to get exercise every day. And if screen time is the exclusion of physical activity, it does have to be taken in hand. Make sure your children are making good choices. So, you know, the worst question you can ask a teenager at secondary school is, what did you do at school today? Because they'll say, not very much. Oh, we did this, and you don't get very well. Ask specific questions and apply that to the online world. What did you see in your social media today? Who were you contacting? Oh, what were they saying? What was good about their day? Trying to avoid the interrogation, but just showing your awareness, okay? Good tip that lots of parents use is getting a cousin or an auntie or an uncle or somebody outside of the immediate family, because most young people don't want their parents on their social media, but they will accept a distant relative who you can just kind of talk to quietly and say, can you give me the heads up if you have a sense that things aren't right here. And, you know, treat online world as you treat your child going to a friend's house. There's got to be some verification that you're happy with it, but you've then got to put some trust and respect around the privacy as well. So we'd like to move forward with some future webinars. We'd like to do something in the future about perhaps what children are seeing online that we don't know about as parents. We haven't touched on here about the very difficult conversations about sexualized content that young people see online, access to porn, vulnerability and aggression, and that might be a subject that people would like a bit of guidance on as well. Really hard, and I always found this hard as a parent, and I find it hard now because I want to stay connected with my children's lives, but I'm also aware that what I can do is intrude on their privacy, and I find that dance around privacy and protection quite difficult. And also Rebecca has also said she would do something about reminding about healthy boundary setting. So I'd like to just share with you the 3 resources that I've used, and also at this point invite Rebecca and Claire on screen while I'm talking. So The Art of Screen Time is no longer in publication, but it is available on Amazon. Don't know if they deliver to Hong Kong addresses, but you can get it delivered to UK addresses, and you can actually download a iBook version. Bit of an irony there, isn't there? We're looking at this on screens, but it's a great book, and it's written for you as the parent, and you'll see a lot of content from that book in this presentation. Glow Kids, I think, is a bit more unbalanced, but it's helpful in terms of learning how to set boundaries. And at the moment on Netflix is a great documentary called Social Dilemma, and I would really recommend you have a look at that, because it just tells you the hidden dark world of social media and all the psychological tricks that they've put in place to make sure that you and your children are sucked in for as long as possible to give data to media advertising companies. So I'd very much like to stop there, and we're well over time, so I could understand it if some parents wanted to drop out at this point. You're very welcome to, but what we'll do is perhaps just give a few minutes to anything that Claire and Rebecca you've been observing or has popped up as questions for you.
I think the first thing, Chris, I'd like to say is just a thank you to the parents that have been sharing resources as you've been chatting this evening.
Great.
Which is wonderful, and thank you for all those comments, and really good. So looking forward to looking at those. And the concerns that were shared at the beginning were, I think, Chris, you addressed them in the presentation, concerns about becoming a recluse or not socialising with friends were some key concerns that were coming through, lack of balance, and the ability to think less independently with all this information coming at your children. But I think one thing from listening to you and working with parents is that opening ourselves up to social media, and it's such a rich resource and can bring some very powerful and engaging conversations with your child if you approach it with the right questions and in the right way. So, you know, you're talking about the video games and the key features of them, and bringing that up as a conversation with your child. What, you know, why do you think this game is so engaging, that it's so difficult to stop playing? And it can be a really rich conversation that can lead into the design of it, the psychology behind it. I think if you can approach it with less of a threatening perception, it can be a real rich resource to drive values and management.
Can I just add to that, Claire, as well, that I noticed people have put things up about the documentary Screenagers, which is a good documentary, but I'd also caution, because we have to be aware of moral panic. And I'm not a qualified psychologist, I don't pretend to be, but what I do know, if psychologists are on here, they would be outraged by some of the content in Screenagers where they allude to addiction. Addiction is a very specific pathological condition that psychologists themselves don't agree on. So there is also something about us being critical of the documentaries that are being presented to us, because they're being filmed that way to get our attention. And it really is about that critical thinking approach. It's looking for the nuggets of truth, but not believing everything in the same way that we're thinking about screen times. There are some nuggets of truth, but not all of it is going to be truth. So what works with us? I'm sorry to cut you off there, Claire, but over to you if there was anything you or Rebecca wanted to finish off with.
No, just what I was, you know, some parents were saying, do we have these conversations with young people at school? And just to reassure all of you this evening, yes, we do. And we will continue to and drip feed, and those messages do get through. We've got lots of amazingly responsible young people that will come and approach us about concerns that they have. So yeah, a lot of good things happening around social media.
Rebecca, anything to add, or things to notice from your own child rearing? Because you've got 3 boys as well, haven't you?
Yeah, I mean, all I'll say is that it's really easy to panic. And there are some real concerns with screen use and our young people. But I think the key is to encourage meaningful screen time and to look at, as you say, the content of what they're doing rather than the total time spent. And to try and have those really authentic, meaningful conversations with them. So asking them what it is they're doing, like taking an interest, even if you don't have any interest in the games that they're playing. just try and ask a few questions. Better still, get them to teach you how to play some of the games that they love. But it kind of, you know, it will build the relationship, and then things will get easier from there.
Yeah, my limit is Mario Kart, I have to say. But I just thought we could just maybe just touch on a few. But please, parents, you're very welcome to drop out. But I'm just going to pull up the question and answers which have come up here. Lack of self-discipline for young people and getting distracted and being multitasking very easily. Absolutely, that's what being young is all about, isn't it? And so it's about, as parents, consciously putting boundaries in, but negotiating that with young people. So allowing young people to have those moments of lack of self-discipline and being scatty and having their attention distracted, but then there's a moment when it's not to be like that. So accept it's going to happen and think about the boundaries you put around it. You're absolutely right that young people, whilst they're working online, can get distracted by their mobile phone. So as a parent, you have to have a strategy that the mobile phone sits in another room. It is the only way to manage it, because the device is so clever in drawing us in. So as parents, we have to go above my concern is to my action is. And what that's another great thing is I can be concerned about my gambling if I go to the races on a Wednesday night. May that come back very soon, because I love doing that. But what I could say to myself is my action when I go gambling on a Wednesday night to the races is to spend no more than $150 in total. So as a parent, what I would advise you to do is turn your concern into an action, and then run it through with your children and say, this is my concern, it's my concern because of this, so this is the action I'm proposing. And perhaps don't be willing to negotiate on what that action is, but just have a sense of listening to your child to see if there is anything you should take on board. Yep, screen ages is helpful, but as I said, there are very, very few people who are going to become addicted. It's going to sit more in the category of problematic behaviour. The other thing I would say to parents is, as parents, sometimes we lose our levers over children. Our leverage is, you know, the influence we can have. It's very natural in some ways that we don't have it, and normally it's bound up with when we've been inconsistent. I am as guilty as this as the next person for certain areas in my parenting. Sometimes with parents where the child simply won't listen to the parent about gaming consoles, we've actually suggested, well, the gaming console gets put away in the adult's cupboard. Sometimes if a child has very, very problematic behaviour, what they do is then they lie and they might sneak to get the gaming console out. And so what we then do is we can work with parents to put very specific contracts in place, and we can actually have that conversation with the parent and with the child in the room, so the child is actually hearing it from the school, and you as the parent are getting more leverage if the behaviour is very problematic. So I just wanted to let you know that. Thanks very much to the feedback that you've all given. That's very gratefully received. I'm glad to know these parenting seminars are good. We love them because it just means you don't have to slog out on the evening. And I know that in the feedback form, one of the things that Rebecca was going to suggest was that if any of you had something specific you would like to explore in one of these seminars, that if you made a note of it on that form, then we'll make sure that we put some thought into how we can help and support you. But other than that, I'd just like to say a huge thank you for being here alongside us. If you, as always, if you've got anything you want to ask us, pick up the phone. We're here for you. We're parents, we're professionals, and we are human. So it's a goodbye from me.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Good night.
Bye.
Good evening. We'll switch our mics and cameras off now. Goodbye.